Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're going to be looking at another one of Dr. William Lane Craig's animated videos. This one is on how it is that Jesus Christ can be the only way to God. Sometimes this gets called the doctrine of Christian particularism. And my guest is Dr. Tomas Bogardus. He's a professor of philosophy at Pepperdine University. He's been on several times. He's one of my favorites, and that's not just me saying that. He's really sharp. Thank you for joining me again, Thomas.
All right, thank you for having me. Good to be back. It's been a while. I'm happy to be back with you.
I thought you would be a great person to bring on for this because you've written a paper that's related to this topic. It's on the "if you'd been born elsewhere" objection, which does come up in the course of this video. If the viewer's like, I don't know what that objection is, don't worry, it's coming. But that's why I brought you on. You've written a paper that's closely related to this topic. And you may be able to go a bit beyond that paper based on what the video says. I want to pick your brain on some other things here. So are you ready to get started?
I'm ready.
In AD 203, the Roman government arrested a 22-year-old woman, a Christian named Perpetua. The problem wasn't so much that she worshipped Jesus. Her crime was that she worshipped only Jesus. She refused to worship any other gods. As a result, she was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. This dangerous idea that Christ alone provides the way to God is called Christian particularism.
There they just kind of set up the idea of Christian particularism. Did you want to comment on that part of the video?
Yeah, when I watched that part of the video, I thought it would be nice to hear a little more about the story of Perpetua and Felicity, just especially one bit that I learned only after converting to Catholicism, and that was that Perpetua was 22 years old. She just had a baby. She still had an infant child with her when she was condemned to die. Initially, she was condemned to die by being gored by a rabid heifer, I guess. The Romans thought it was appropriate to have the sex of the beast match the sex of the victim. So they had to choose a female cow. And so Perpetua was in this arena, and this heifer, I guess, threw her up into the air. So when she landed, she realized that her hair had come down, and that was a sign of mourning. So if you were mourning the death of someone, you'd let your hair down or something like that. And so her first reaction when realizing that her hair was let down was to, according to another prisoner who continued her diary after this, the next thing that happened was Perpetua started asking for a pin, or looking for a pin to pin up her disheveled hair. Wow. And what she said was, it was not meet that a martyr should suffer with hair disheveled, lest she might seem to be mourning in her hour of triumph. Which I think
that's really profound.
I know, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Wow.
So a lot to admire in the story of Perpetua. So I just wanted to add that really quickly. And I guess also I just wanted to add that it's not 100% clear that Perpetua and the other catechumens with her were sentenced because they were particularists, or condemned to die because they were particularists. It's rather, my understanding is that the Romans were seeking to foster internal unity, and especially in the light of external threats and external invaders. And so they were disturbed by the presence of religions, not just Christianity, but also Judaism, that encouraged their adherents not to worship the emperor or worship the Roman gods. So it was really an attempt to stifle disunity. So it wasn't just that the Christians were particularists. They weren't the right kind of particularists, I guess. They were the kind that were sowing dissension or division within the empire. But that's not the main point of the video. We should probably move on.
Religious pluralism, on the other hand, is the view that all the world's religions are equally valid, and Christ is just one of many ways. Some religious pluralists say all the world's religions teach basically the same thing, so they are all true. But this is clearly mistaken. The major religions often contradict each other. For example, compare Islam and Buddhism. Muslims believe there is a personal God who created the world. Man is sinful and will spend eternity in heaven or hell, and salvation is attained by faith and performing good works. But Buddhists deny all of this. They believe that ultimate reality is not a person. The world was not created. Man is not sinful. Man is not an enduring self. And the goal of life is not salvation, it's annihilation. Because these two worldviews contradict each other, they can't both be true.
Look, I know it's just a 5-minute apologetic video, so we shouldn't be too nitpicky, but it's my understanding that there are different sorts of traditions or schools within Buddhism, and I thought it at least should be pointed out in case anyone wants to have a conversation with a Buddhist. You should know that, and especially with regard to that last doctrine where we were told that the goal of Buddhism is not salvation but annihilation. My understanding is there's different opinions among Buddhists about what nirvana is, what the goal of this whole practice is. And there are some schools that say after death we are annihilated and consciousness ceases. But there are at least 2 other schools that I know of that teach otherwise. And my understanding is the Buddha himself and early sources within Buddhism describe nirvana with words like a cessation or a blowing out. But it's also sometimes described in positive terms as the good, or purity, or peace, or truth, or most provocatively, the further shore. And so it's sort of left open whether death means annihilation in the Buddhist tradition. And it depends on which Buddhist you ask. So I thought I would just point that out. But again, the point of this video right here is just that the major world religions contradict each other. And I think that's 100% true.
Okay, we'll continue.
In fact, every major world religion contradicts every other one, so they can't possibly all be true. So other religious pluralists will say, all the world's religions are false. They're equally valid, but equally false, cultural expressions of mankind's search for truth. But why think that this is true? Why couldn't one particular religion be true? When you examine the arguments for religious pluralism, you find that some of them are textbook examples of logical fallacies. For example, anyone who believes that Christianity is true and every other view is wrong is arrogant. Therefore, Christianity is false. This is a logical fallacy called argument ad hominem, trying to show someone's view is false by attacking his personal character. This is a logical fallacy because the truth of a view is independent of the character of the person who holds it.
Right. So here I had the thought that, there were quotation marks there. We were told that some examples of arguments for pluralism are textbook cases of deductive fallacies or logical fallacies. And there were quotation marks around that. The quotation wasn't attributed to anyone. And I wonder who this video has in mind, who's argued that way. And then the response was, well, this is just a logical fallacy. This is an argument ad hominem. And I was just going to say for your viewers, I was just going to give a little bit of caution against thinking in those terms, thinking in terms of deductive fallacies. And some people think that the task of the critical thinker is to have a list of informal fallacies memorized, and I guess formal fallacies too, and just be ready to throw out those terms, and even better if they're in Latin or something like that.
It's so true.
Yeah, but my worry is that if you win an argument that way, the victory is going to be sort of shallow and short-lived. And if you don't steel man your opponent's position, someone else will. And it may be your opponent or it may be someone else, but then you're going to look pretty silly if you were attacking a version of the argument that isn't the strongest. So what I would have recommended, even though I recognize this is a 5-minute apologetic video, would have been nice to actually come up with real life examples of people arguing this way. The closest I could find of like a real philosopher arguing this way in a way that could be described as an argument from Arrogance was Philip Kitcher, who in a 2010 essay called The Challenge of Secularism said this: most Christians have adopted their doctrines much as polytheists and the ancestor worshippers have acquired theirs, through early teaching and socialization. Had the Christians been born among the Aboriginal Australians, they would believe in just the same ways, on just the same bases, and with just the same convictions, doctrines about dreamtime instead of about the resurrection. The symmetry is complete. Given that they are all on a par, we should trust none of them. So that's the end of the quotation. And so I understand the word arrogant didn't show up here. That would have been pretty inflammatory language. But the idea seems to be that adherents of world religions have the same kind of evidence as each other. So that's why Philip Kitcher says, if Christians had been brought up among the Aboriginal Australians, they would have different beliefs, but he says they would believe in just the same ways, on just the same bases, and with just the same convictions. And he describes this as a case where the symmetry is complete. So he thinks that when you look around at the great world religions, you'll find a kind of symmetry. Everybody has the same kind of evidence. The evidence is pointing in different directions, obviously, but it's the same kind of evidence. Maybe they all have a certain kind of religious experience in their favor. They all have sacred scripture that they look to, perhaps. They all have the testimony of people that they consider to be authorities. They have the same kind of evidence. And at the very least, it's not clear, according to Philip Kitcher, who has better evidence here. It's the same kind of evidence in each case. It's not clear that one group has better evidence than any other group. And so although this isn't said explicitly, maybe the idea is something like, if in the face of that sort of disagreement, you persisted in holding your beliefs, you remained steadfast in your own beliefs, that would be a kind of, I don't know if arrogance is the right word, but a sort of question-begging or arbitrary preference for your own views over other views that are just as well supported as your own. So it's a kind of self-favoring that, I don't know, might be described as arrogance. You think that you're right just because you're you. You know, you like your views because they're yours. You favor your views because they happen to be yours, even though these other people that you know of have equally good evidence, equally good bases. So there, I think we get something close to what this video is attacking. It's a kind of, it's an argument that has to do with peer disagreement. And it appeals to a kind of principle that you see in the peer disagreement literature. And the principle is, if you're disagreeing with someone and you think they're just as well positioned as you and they have just as good evidence as you have, or even if it's just not clear who has better evidence and it's not clear who's smarter or better positioned, if any of those things are happening, then it would be arbitrary or question begging to prefer your answer just because it's yours. It's like saying, well, I'm me, so I win, or something like that. So I think that might be what the video is getting at here. So yeah, the argument, just to state it a little more formally, and then you can say something if you want. The argument is something like, the evidence in favor of all the major world religions is balanced. It's symmetrical. So it's like a case of peer disagreements, or at the very least, it's not clear who's better positioned. So that's step one. And then step two is, in a situation like that, the rational response is to suspend belief. As Philip Kitcher says, to trust none of them. You shouldn't trust any of these religious traditions. If you remain steadfast, if you held on to your own views in light of this disagreement, that would be question begging or arbitrarily self-favoring. Okay, and so what follows from those two premises is we should suspend belief, we should trust none of these major world religions. So just really quickly, I want to point out, Philip Kitcher's conclusion isn't that Christianity is false. That indeed would be a logical fallacy. It would be saying Christians are behaving poorly or being irrational or responding to evidence incorrectly, therefore their beliefs are false. That wouldn't follow. Rather, the conclusion is something more about what we're justified in believing, what the rational response to this sort of situation is. And according to Philip Kitcher, the rational response is suspension of belief, not trusting any of these religious traditions. So I think that's a Steelman version of the argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I have some criticisms, but because this version of the argument, when we Steelman it, when we think about the best version, is pretty similar to the next argument that we hear, I thought maybe we should just move on in
Yeah,
the video.
that sounds good.
Moreover, this objection is a double-edged sword, for the pluralist also believes that his view is true and that everyone else is wrong. Therefore, if you're arrogant for holding to a view which many others disagree with, then the pluralist himself would be guilty of arrogance.
Right. So I wanted to pause there because, so just want to quickly repeat that I think it's a bit of a straw man to interpret the argument as trying to conclude that Christianity is false because Christians are arrogant. I think a stronger version of the argument fleshes out what the arrogance charge is. And it's something like arbitrarily favoring your own view, even in the face of something like pure disagreement. So that's the premise. And then the conclusion isn't that Christianity is false. It's something more like it's irrational or unjustified or something like that. But I also wanted to say that I think this self-defeat response is a good response, even to the Steelman version of the argument, because if the worry is that, we're in a situation where there's symmetry between all these answers to religious questions, there's symmetry between these great world religions, that would also seem to apply to pluralism itself. The pluralist is in the same sort of situation where they're believing, aren't they believing on the same bases, in the same ways, with the same kind of convictions, that their view is true, even though there are all these intelligent, well-informed people disagreeing with them. So yeah, I think that self-defeat response is a good kind of response, even to the Steelman version of the argument. But again, before I completely explore that response, I thought we should look at the second version of the argument because it's so adjacent. So let's look at that.
Here is another pluralist argument. Religions are culturally relative. If you had been born in Pakistan, you'd likely be a Muslim. But if you'd been born in Ireland, you'd probably be a Catholic. Because religious beliefs are culturally relative, they are not objectively true. This is an example of the genetic fallacy, trying to invalidate a view by showing how a person came to hold the view. This is a fallacy because the truth of a view is independent of how a person came to believe it.
Right. So again, we're being told that the argument is challenging the truth of Christianity or the truth of your particular religious beliefs. But and then we're told, well, that's a genetic fallacy. And that's the case. Yeah, that version of the argument does commit the genetic fallacy. A belief could be true even if it came from a bad source or a bad method or bad evidence. Even if you were just randomly guessing, that doesn't show that your belief is false. So just imagine somebody taking a math test and then they, pick an answer. It's a multiple choice test. They pick an answer and you ask them why, and they say, I'm just guessing. That doesn't show that they're wrong. The answer that they picked may be true, but something else is going on there that is still, that we can still criticize, right? They're not justified in believing that that's the correct answer. They haven't arrived at that answer in a rational way, in a way that we should give them credit for. They don't really know that that answer is true. At best, they're right by luck. They're correct by luck. So yeah, again, I think it's a little uncharitable to interpret the pluralist as arguing against the truth of Christianity on the basis of this kind of elsewhere, elsewhen consideration. Rather, I think that if you listen to pluralists themselves, you'll see that this isn't the way they're arguing. Previously in the video, we saw a little image of John Hick. John Hick started his life as sort of like lukewarm, didn't really have any religious views. And then my understanding is, based on his spiritual autobiography, he became a Christian when he was around the age of 17 as a result of hanging out with the InterVarsity group. So he became an evangelical, and then he went to grad school and earned his PhD, still an evangelical. But then my understanding is his first position was in Birmingham, which was a very religiously diverse place. And he started hanging out with people of different religious traditions and working with people of different religious traditions. And he gives two arguments for his pluralism. There were two things that convinced him to give up evangelicalism and become a pluralist. And one of them was this argument here. he started reflecting on the fact that, if he had been raised as these other people had been raised, he would have had very different beliefs. And if Christians had been raised as the Muslims had been raised, they would have had different religious beliefs. So it was this sort of elsewhere, else when kind of argument. That was one of the reasons that convinced John Hick to become a pluralist. So let me just state the argument in his own words. I have his statement of the argument here. So this is from an essay titled "The Epistemological Challenge of Religious Pluralism" from 1997. So he says, quote, "Religious allegiance depends in the great majority of cases on the accident of birth. Someone born into a devout Muslim family in Pakistan is very likely to be a Muslim. Someone born into a devout Hindu family in India to be a Hindu. Someone born into a devout Christian family in Spain or Mexico to be a Catholic Christian, and so on. The conclusion I have drawn," so this is Hick talking. Well, now this is me talking about Hick talking.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the conclusion that he draws. It's not that Christianity is false. He says, "The conclusion I have drawn is that a hermeneutic of suspicion is appropriate in relation to beliefs that have been instilled into one by the surrounding religious culture." Okay, so what does he mean by hermeneutic of suspicion? Unfortunately, he never really says, but I think what he means is you should doubt these religious beliefs of yours if they were just instilled into you by the surrounding culture. If you believe them because of how you happen to have been raised, if you just kind of took other people's word for it, then you should be suspicious of those beliefs. Now, whether being suspicious means you need to give them up entirely or just lower your confidence, he doesn't really say. But what he definitely doesn't say is, well, that means the beliefs are false. He doesn't say that. He just says you need to be suspicious of them. Okay, so that's how John Hick put it. I thought your viewers might be interested to hear that Richard Dawkins seems to have been influenced by this kind of thought as well. So in An Appetite for Wonder, The Makings of a Scientist from 2013, Richard Dawkins says this. He says, my move to atheism began at age 9 when I realized that this is the quote part, that Christianity was one of many religions and they contradicted each other. They couldn't all be right. So why believe the one in which by sheer accident of birth I happened to be brought up? So notice again, he doesn't try to conclude that Christianity is false because of religious disagreement. He just wonders, like, why should I believe it? Why should I hold it? What reasons do I have? Do I have good reason? I just happen to have been brought up in the Christian tradition. I easily might have been brought up in a different tradition. So yeah, his concern seems to be not about the truth of Christianity, but about his justification for believing it, whether he has good reason to believe it. Okay, so I wanted to mention that again. I think that if your viewers encounter this kind of thought, I guess this might be a good first move in the conversation to say, like, well, genetic fallacies are bad. Are we committing the genetic fallacy here? But you should be aware that, like, an easy second move that the pluralist or the skeptic is going to make is, look, the argument isn't targeting the truth of Christianity, it's targeting the rationality or justification.
Yes.
Okay, so there's like a flat-footed first attempt at understanding the argument. It's just pointed out that, as the video put it, I think religious belief is culturally relative. I think they said that. If you had been born elsewhere, elsewhen, so to speak, if you had been born at a different time in a different place, you would have had different beliefs on religious topics. So what follows from that it's not meant to be that your religious beliefs are false, it's that your religious beliefs are unjustified or irrational, or in any case, you don't really know that they're true. If you're right, you're like the person who was right by luck, guessing on that math test. You're basically guessing.
All of this is from what I've read of Craig, a kind of standard way of setting up the problem where it targets the truth of the belief, and then he gives this counterexample.
For example, if you had been born in ancient Greece, you would have believed that the sun goes around the earth. Does that make your current belief that the earth goes around the sun false or unjustified? No.
I guess I was made aware recently that it's not necessarily true that if I had been born and raised in ancient Greece, I would have been a geocentrist. Aristotle was, but I was just recently, by coincidence, reading his work on the heavens. And he spends quite a bit of time explicitly arguing against some rival views that he was aware of that were heliocentric, which is kind of interesting. So it's true. I mean, we saw an image of Aristotle, and he was a geocentrist. He thought the Earth was at the center of the universe, but not all ancient Greeks were. And so I guess I might have been a geocentrist had I been born in ancient Greece, but not necessarily. So that would just be to quibble with the example. There are lots of other examples of how my beliefs about science would have been different had I been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhere. But I just wanted to point that out so that your viewers know there were heliocentrists in ancient Greece. And in fact, my understanding is that Copernicus decided to rethink the data and rethink the model of the solar system, partly because he was aware that there were heliocentrists in ancient Greece. And he was wondering, like, well, what if I considered that model of the solar system? Would that better explain the data? But I think this or something like it would be a good example to the kind of flat-footed first attempt at the argument that we looked at a minute ago, the one that just points out, hey, your religious beliefs would have been different had you been born and raised elsewhere, else when. That's the premise. And then the conclusion is, you don't really know that those religious beliefs are true. You're not justified. It's not rational for you to hold them. You should give them up, something like that. So I think this would be a good counterexample of that. And notice, I mean, it's also a counterexample to the straw man version of the argument, but even to the stronger version of the argument, I think this is a good counterexample. Alvin Plantinga gives a similar kind of example. I think his is even better. So maybe set aside the geocentrist one and use this one instead. This one I think is better. So Alvin Plantinga, in response to John Hick, gives the example of his Plantinga's belief that he was born in Michigan. Yeah, so just in your own case, think about your belief about where you were born. I believe I was born in Long Beach, California. It's true though that if I had been born somewhere else and at a different time, I wouldn't believe that I was born in Long Beach, right? Because it's sort of built into the antecedent there that I was born somewhere else at a different time. Mm-hmm. So probably I wouldn't have believed that I was born in Long Beach. Does that give me reason to think that I'm unjustified in believing that I was born in Long Beach, or that I don't really know I was born in Long Beach, or that I should give up that belief? I should be skeptical of that belief. Well, no, because in this case, in the place of birth case, although it's true that if I had been born elsewhere, else when, I would have had a different belief. I still would have had a true belief in that case. It would have been different, but it would have been true. And importantly, I would have had different evidence in that case. In the actual case, the evidence I have is my parents and my birth certificate telling me I was born in Long Beach. In this hypothetical scenario, this counterfactual scenario we're thinking of, I would have different evidence. My parents in that scenario would be telling me something else, and my birth certificate in that scenario would be telling me something else. So although my belief would have been different, it doesn't follow that it would have been unjustified or irrational, because my different belief may still have been true and still may have been well supported. So again, the flat-footed version of the argument just said, your belief easily could have been different. Therefore, you need to give it up, or you're irrational, or you're unjustified. So this sort of example and the geocentric example, the ancient Greece example, I think those examples nicely show that that doesn't follow. There may be some beliefs of mine that I hold that easily could have been different, may have been different. It doesn't follow that they're false or unjustified or irrational or anything like that. The geocentric case is a little different. So when I imagine being born and raised in ancient Greece and studying under Aristotle, let's say, then I would have had a different belief. I would have believed that the sun moves around the earth. I would have believed that. And the belief would have been false. But importantly, I would have had misleading evidence. I would have had bad evidence in that case. So in order to fix the argument and make it a little stronger, in order to steel man it further, to move from the flat-footed first attempt at the argument to a stronger version of the argument. I think what we should do is something like this. I think what John Hick has in mind when he gives this argument is something more like this. Look, if you had been born elsewhere and elsewhen and used the same method you actually used, you would have had false beliefs about religious topics, not just different beliefs, but false beliefs. So we need to specify in the premise that you're using the same method you actually used. And it's not just that your belief would have been different. The problem is that your belief would have been false by your own lights. So this helps us circumvent the place of birth counterexample and the ancient Greece counterexample. Because in the ancient Greece case, we're not using the same method. In ancient Greece, we would have been using a very primitive kind of science. It's hardly science at all. Whereas in the actual scenario, I'm using like a advanced kind of a much better kind of science. So I'm not using the same method. So I'm not going to get a counterexample to the main inference of the argument from this geocentric case. Yeah, I kind of wish we could display the argument so people could see this, but the way the geocentric counterexample was supposed to work is it was supposed to be a case where the general principle behind the first premise is true, and yet the conclusion doesn't follow. But if we fix the argument like this, the general principle behind the first premise is no longer true, because the general principle is something like, if you ever find yourself in this sort of situation, you have a belief that easily could have been false using the same method you actually used, then you should doubt that belief. So we need those two things to happen. It easily could have been false, and you've got to be using the same method you actually used. So in the geocentric case, I wouldn't be using the same method that I actually used. And in the planning a case of my belief about where I was born, that's not a belief that easily could have been false. In these other scenarios, we're imagining where I was born somewhere else, my belief wouldn't have been false. I wouldn't have had a false belief. I would have had a true belief. So this stronger version of the argument sidesteps both of those sort of counterexamples. If you remember the quotation from Hick, this kind of seems to be what Hick was getting at when he says, we need to be suspicious in relation to, quote, beliefs that have been instilled into one by the surrounding religious culture. So he seems really focused on methods. It's the particular kind of method that you need to be skeptical of, that you need to be wary of. And that's just having beliefs instilled into you by the surrounding culture. So if that's where you got your belief, you just kind of believe what you were told, and you realize that if you had been raised somewhere else and been told something else, you would have had a false belief. Well, now you need to be suspicious. Okay, so I think it's a little fairer to what Hick actually said.
And in that case, planning is supposed counterexample no longer applies to this.
No longer applies.
It's almost like this is the pluralist argument 3.0. 1.0 was like, I'm just targeting the truth of the belief. 2.0 was, I'm targeting the rationality of the belief. Now 3.0 is, I won't rehearse everything you just said, but it's still targeting the rationality of the belief, but with maybe more, they've added some conditions to try and avoid these counterexamples.
Yeah. And that's how philosophy works. You know, we have a little dialogue, we have a conversation, and proposals are modified and refined with an eye towards improving them and avoiding objections. But here's the danger, especially in the case of like skeptical arguments like this. The version 1.0 argument looks really scary because the conclusion's really scary and the premise is pretty broad. So it looks like it applies to a lot of people and the conclusion is quite startling. So especially if you think of like the version of the argument that the video presented, religious beliefs are culturally relative, therefore they're false. So that looks really scary because you're like, oh my gosh, the premise is obviously true. Religious beliefs are culturally relative. And the conclusion's scary. Oh, my beliefs are false. Oh no, that's scary. But then you start thinking about the skeptical argument and you realize, I'm going to have to narrow the premise a little bit. It's not just that my belief is culturally relative. It's not just that it could have been different if I had been in a different culture. It's something a little more. It's got to be false. My belief easily could have been false. And I have to also have been using the same method I actually used. And we have to soften the conclusion a little bit. The conclusion isn't that your belief is actually now false. The conclusion is rather that your religious beliefs now actually are unjustified, irrational. You should be suspicious of them. Okay, so that's the danger with skeptical arguments. They get watered down as we move through versions. Yeah, and that's, I think, what's happening here. Especially when you consider the next step. So the next part of the video, they give what I think is a good objection. It applies to this version of the argument as well as the arrogance version of the argument. So let's watch this together.
Also a double-edged sword. For if the religious pluralist had been born in Pakistan or Ireland, he'd likely have been a religious particularist. So his belief in religious pluralism is just the result of his being born in contemporary Western society, and therefore is not objectively true. Getting these fallacious...
All right. Yeah, so I didn't make notes about this, but I guess I don't really understand this double-edged sword metaphor, because a double-edged sword doesn't cut you as well as the person you're attacking. So I don't know why we say these sorts of arguments are a double-edged sword, right? Was the danger of a double-edged sword that it would also cut you? Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't know enough about swords.
I'm not. Yeah.
But so what the video brings up here is like a worry about self-defeat. And Alvin Plantinga presented this objection too to John Hick. So now we're gonna modify the argument again, and this will be the last modification, I think.
So this is like 4.0.
Yeah, I think we're at 4.0. I don't know. I lost.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're at 4.0.
Like right after the Michigan counterexample, Plantinga says this again in that essay, "A Defense of Religious Exclusivism." Actually, I don't know if I said the title yet. So if you wanted to find the Michigan counterexample, it's in an essay that Plantinga wrote called "Defense of Religious Exclusivism." Oh, and then also Plantinga repeats this objection in a little essay that he wrote to John Hick called Ad Hick, just sort of like ad hoc, but Ad Hick. Okay, so here's what he said to John Hick. "Pluralism isn't and hasn't been widely popular in the world at large. If the pluralist had been born in Madagascar or medieval France, he probably wouldn't have been a pluralist. Does it follow that he shouldn't be a pluralist, or that his pluralist beliefs are produced in him by an unreliable belief-producing process? I doubt it." So that's the end of the quotation. So I think this is classic Plantinga. Plantinga is one of the things I love about Plantinga is his tendency to point out when people's beliefs are self-defeating. He often applies views to themselves and asks, like, what does the view say about itself? And so I think this was the kind of self-defeat argument that was given in response to that arrogance argument as well, given in response to that symmetry argument. Look, isn't the pluralist in the same position? Why think the pluralist has better evidence or is better positioned to evaluate the evidence than everyone else? So similarly here too, if the worry is, I hold a belief that easily could have been different and false, and I would have been using the same method that I actually used, if that's the problem, doesn't that apply to the pluralists as well? Surely John Hick should recognize that pluralism has not been very popular throughout history. Had John Hick been born in medieval France, he wouldn't have been a pluralist. He would have had different beliefs that by his own lights would have been false, and he would have been using the same method he was actually using, right? So then doesn't the skeptical argument kind of turn on the person who's wielding it the way that a double-edged sword will suddenly come back? And just kidding. I don't think double-edged swords do that. But that's the danger of skeptical arguments. Here's just a pro tip, life hack for your audience. If somebody's ever giving you a skeptical argument, it is worth asking, will this skeptical argument turn on its owner? Less like a double-edged sword, more like a pit bull. Yeah, pit bulls are dangerous.
I'm sure pit bull owners will be like, "You're spreading the stereotype."
Oh yeah, that's right.
That.
Oh, no. Yes. Trigger warning. Okay, maybe it's more like a grenade or something. Trying to use a grenade in a fist fight. It's just as apt to injure you as your opponent. How about that?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Set aside the dogs. Okay, so that's what Plantinga said. Okay, so now I think now we've got a real worry. We've got a real contender for a counterexample to version 3.0 of the pluralist argument. And it's a counterexample that even the pluralist should accept, it looks like. Okay, so here's Hick's response. And then we'll give a final evaluation of this argument after that. So here's what Hick said in response to Plantinga in an essay that I think I mentioned earlier, The Epistemological Challenge of Religious Pluralism. Hick says this, quote, "This is true." So he's acknowledging that he easily might have not been a pluralist had he been born somewhere else. "This is true, but how relevant is it? One is not usually a religious pluralist as a result of having been raised from childhood to be one, as in most cases, one is raised from childhood to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu, etc." Okay, so he says, how relevant is this, Plantinga? One is not a pluralist as a result of having been raised from childhood to be one. So I think what Hick is pointing out, or what he's claiming, is in that counterfactual scenario where John Hick had been born and raised in medieval France and raised a Christian, he would not have been using the same method that he actually used. So this sounds a little bit, I don't know, what's the word, like very optimistic about your own powers of reflection. But what John Hick seems to think is he arrived at his pluralism as a result of like cool, rational reflection. Had he been raised in medieval France, he wouldn't have been able to do that. He would have been basically indoctrinated into Christianity. It would have been foisted upon him. It would have been instilled into him through early teaching and socialization. So the attempt is to avoid the counterexample by getting really clear about what sort of methods we have in mind. And what he's claiming is in those counterfactual situations, he wouldn't have been using the same method. So here in the actual world, he arrived at his pluralism as a result of rational reflection. The danger in the counterfactual scenario is if you arrive at your different false beliefs as a result of early teaching and socialization. So it's a particular kind of method that we need to be worried about. Basically indoctrination, just believing what you're told. Okay, so now version 4.0 of the argument is something like, here's the problem with your religious beliefs. They easily could have been different and false by your own lights. And you would have been using the same method you actually used, which, by the way, is early teaching and socialization, indoctrination, just believing what you're told. Okay, so we're kind of adding a premise here. We're adding an assertion that that's how the religious believer has arrived at his beliefs, early teaching and socialization. Okay, so now I think it might be clear to your audience like what you might say in response. You might say, well, I'm just going to avail myself of the same escape hatch that John Hick took. So when this argument was pointed back in John Hick's direction, what he said was, I'm exempt from the argument because my beliefs are the result of rational reflection. I have evidence and arguments in favor of my beliefs, not like those poor benighted religious believers who just believe whatever they're told. Mm-hmm. Well, that's simply not true of all religious believers, right? It's not true of me, and it's not true of you, and it's not true of anybody watching this video right now. If you are rationally reflecting on your religious beliefs and thinking about arguments and evidence, then you are a candidate for the same exemption that John Hick gave to himself. You can just say, well, the method I actually used is rational reflection. I've collected evidence. I've evaluated arguments. I am not a victim of early teaching and socialization. I'm not a victim of indoctrination. So the premises of the argument no longer apply to me.
If I may, let me try to summarize very briefly. I may cut this out if I do a terrible job, but hopefully I can be concise. Version 1.0 has a premise something like this. If you had been born elsewhere in Elsewhere, you would have had a different belief. And because of that situation, or because of that circumstance, or that fact, or whatever, your beliefs, your current beliefs about those things are false.
Yes.
That's 1.0.
That's the version we got in the video. Yes.
Yeah, that's the version we got in the video. Version 2.0 is if you'd been born elsewhere or elsewhen, you would have had a different belief. And because of that fact, your beliefs are irrational. Counterexample to that is the Plantinga if I had been born in blah, 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 then what? Okay. In that case, yeah, I've got a
And
different
the
belief, but it's,
geocentrism.
yeah, and the geocentrism. Okay, so then comes version 3.0. Version 3.0 says if you'd been born elsewhere or elsewhen, and you had been using the same method, but your beliefs could have easily been false, then you should be, maybe then your belief's irrational, or you should at least be skeptical of your belief. Okay, so now we added the conditions about you're using the same method, and most importantly is the belief could have easily been false. That wasn't the case in 2.0, but now it is the case. Your belief could have easily been false. Okay, and the reply to that was this would work the same on the the pluralist. The pluralist, if he had been born elsewhere, then from his perspective, that would have been false, and he'd be using the same method, apparently, but they'll reply to that. So then that's the counterexample. So then comes version 4.0, and version 4.0 says, if you'd been born elsewhere, elsewhen, you'd been using the same method, your belief could have been easily false. And oh, by the way, that method is early teaching and socialization. Then you should be skeptical of the belief, or then your belief's unjustified.
Yeah, so we're sort of adding a premise or assertion that the religious believers, as a matter of fact, use that bad method. So
yes.
Yeah. So in this counterfactual scenario we're considering, they're using the same method, they arrive at a different false belief, and oh, by the way, that method is really terrible. That's the actual method they're using. Okay, so we have to kind of add a premise in there, and then that's the one that Hick is going to deny. He's going to say, that's not true of me. I don't use that bad method. I'm rational.
Right. Yeah. And so then any religious believer who says, well, wait a minute, that bad method, I don't use that either. I know, Hick, you say you don't use it. I don't use it either. I try to be rational and look at all different evidences, blah, blah, blah. That probably wasn't as concise as I'd hoped, but that's my best attempt at summarizing it.
There's kind of one more thing I'd like to say, just to let your viewers know that we've gotten to version 4.0, but we're still not at our final destination. The landscape still stretches before us. Well, I guess I also just want to briefly mention, I mentioned that John Hick had two arguments for pluralism. One of them did not appear in this video. One of them was what's become known as the argument from meager moral fruits. So one of the things that convinced John Hick to give up Christianity was when he was working with Hindus and Muslims and atheists and people of all different kinds of religious traditions, what he thought he observed was morally, they were all kind of on a par. Morally, they all behaved roughly the same way. No group was clearly morally superior to any other group. So that was one premise. And then the second premise was, if Christianity is true, then Christians should be morally superior to non-Christians. If only because Christianity promises you a certain kind of treatment upon becoming a Christian, the regeneration of the Holy Spirit. You should become sanctified through your cooperation with the regenerative work of the Holy Spirit. You should become a better person. You should get all these fruits of the Spirit. And Jesus sort of promises that you'll know a tree by its fruits. Christians should have good moral fruits. Okay, and so John Hick concluded on the basis of those two premises that Christianity is not true. So, well, now I just kind of meant to mention that argument, but now I feel like it's just hanging out there and we should say something in response.
It works, and we should just go home.
So in conclusion, that argument's good, and there's no good response. Now, I'm actually sort of thinking about a paper these days responding to that. I'm inclined to accept the second premise. I think that the Christians are promised a treatment effect, and becoming a Christian should improve your behavior, and you should see the fruits of the Spirit. You should see improved behavior. And so if we really were to conduct a kind of clinical trial, I would hope, and I think this is a prediction, an empirical prediction of Christianity. Christianity improves the behavior of genuine Christians. The problem is it would be really hard to design a clinical trial like that. If only because it would be hard to actually know who received the treatment and who didn't. What the Bible tends to say is, if you want to know who the true Christians are, if you want to know who's really following Jesus, you'll know by their works.
Right.
So if you wanted to recruit a cohort for this study, you would have to find people who are behaving well. You'd have to find people who are sort of showing the moral fruits. And then, of course, you'll conclude, oh, well, I guess Christianity had a positive effect on them. So there's that sort of limitation in devising the clinical trial. It's not like a drug trial where we can administer the drug to the patient and then see how it works. Imparting the gift of the Holy Spirit is not up to us. So we can't determine who got it and who didn't. So it'd be hard to actually design a clinical trial like that. So that's something I've been thinking about these days. But about the elsewhere, else when argument, I wanted to say that the self-defeat response is pretty good. And if to survive the self-defeat response, the pluralist or the skeptic carves out an exemption for himself that says, like, well, if you're rational, it's okay, then I think, yeah, the Christian can use that same exemption. At least the rational, reflective Christian can. So I think that's a good enough response. But another worry about that argument is it's relying on some assumptions about what's required for knowledge. And the assumption is something like, in order to know that a proposition is true, the method that you use could not easily have misled you, which is a condition that epistemologists call safety. In order for you to know that a proposition is true, the method you use must have been safe, must have been reliable, couldn't easily have misled you. So I've come to believe that's not actually a condition on knowledge. And so I think the strongest final version of this argument would rely on a principle about knowledge that's actually true. And I think that principle about knowledge that's actually true is, in order for you to know that a proposition is true, you have to be connected to the truth in the right sort of way. You have to hold that belief ultimately because the belief's true. If you trace back the story of how you got this belief, the story better mention the truth of the belief. And that's how we, a reason to think that this is a requirement of knowledge is, this is generally how we try to debunk each other's beliefs. This is how we try to undermine each other's beliefs. If I want to challenge one of your beliefs, if I want to try to convince you to give up a belief, I can do it directly by trying to convince you that the belief is false. And that's because knowledge requires truth. So in order to convince you to give up a belief, I can try to convince you that your belief's not true. That's like a direct attack. That's a rebutting defeater. But knowledge doesn't require only truth. It also requires something else, something that we call justification or rationality or something like that. It requires you to be connected to the truth in the right sort of way. And we also challenge that when we try to debunk or undermine each other's beliefs. So the way that typically sounds is when somebody tells you, well, you just believe that because, and then you get this kind of deviant causal path that led to your belief. So if I believe something on the basis of a coin flip or a magic 8-ball, then we can see that the explanation of my belief doesn't require that the belief be true. There's no connection between the magic 8-ball and the truth. Just like there's no connection between like disgust and the truth of political beliefs. One came to mind. Here's another kind of debunking argument you hear of theistic beliefs. Well, you believe in God just because you want there to be like life after death. It's a kind of wish fulfillment. You want there to be this all-loving father figure in the sky. So yeah, because of wish fulfillment. So there's a kind of debunking argument because the thought is your wishes don't have the right kind of connection to the truth in order for it to be knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I guess Karl Marx also, like, he thought that the reason people adhere to religions is because they're in unhealthy economic environments that sort of stress them out and depress them. And so religion's the opiate of the masses. That's why it's so common. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of coping mechanism. So religion's a kind of coping mechanism. So there too, that's like an undermining defeater. Like, you just believe that because you're coping. And there too, the reason we think that's effective is we think believing something because it makes you feel better isn't connected to the truth. It's not connected to the truth in the right sort of way to be knowledge. What we want is like to believe that this water bottle is orange. Because I'm having a certain kind of experience, and I'm having that experience because of the light reflecting off of it, and the light's reflecting off of it in that way because the water bottle really is orange. So that's the good case, where like you believe something ultimately because it's true. when we offer each other undermining defeaters, we're trying to show you don't really believe it because it's true. You believe it for this other reason. Okay, so I think that this elsewhere, else when argument is just another instance of that same argument form. The purpose of the counterfactual consideration, where you imagine yourself being born and raised somewhere else at another time, is to try to get you to believe that, oh man, I don't really hold my religious beliefs because they're true. I hold them just because of who my parents happen to be, where I happen to go to school, etc. So I don't hold them because they're true. I hold them for these other reasons that aren't really connected to the truth. And I don't know if I mentioned this on a previous stream with you or elsewhere, but I think I've told this story before, how I learned that the reason I was raised Lutheran was ultimately because of a real estate decision of my grandparents.
Yes,
They
yeah.
raised my mom Lutheran because of where they have, because the Lutheran church was the nearest one to their house when they moved to Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay, so then when I learned that, it was like really unsettling for me. I was like, oh no. The only reason I'm Lutheran is because of a real estate decision. That's not good. That's not the kind of connection to the truth that you want. So that just inspired me to like actually start thinking about it, and like,
if you'd been born elsewhere, you wouldn't be a Lutheran. If you'd just been born on the other end of town, you might be a Catholic now.
A Catholic,
wait,
exactly.
You are a Catholic now.
That's right. Yeah, well, I converted to Catholicism partly because of like the grad school that I happened to choose. Rob Coons was there, and he was converting to Catholicism, and I met some intelligent Catholics in my cohort. I easily might have gone to a different grad program, and I never would have met those people. Who knows what would have happened? Maybe I would have remained Lutheran, or maybe I would have lost my faith. I don't know. So it's those sorts of considerations that we all agree like are kind of unsettling, because they get you to wonder, they get you to think like, oof, do I hold these beliefs because they're true? Do I actually have good arguments and evidence for them? Or am I just the victim of like social forces? Am I just kind of drifting along the current of these social forces, being pushed in various directions, depending on who I happen to meet and where my grandparents happen to live? So yeah, I think that's the final version of this argument says something like that. So here's how it would go, I think. The first premise, again, just as an assertion, it's an assertion that you are the victim of socialization. You hold these religious beliefs as a result of early teaching and socialization. You were basically indoctrinated. And then we conclude from that you don't hold your religious beliefs because they're true. Okay, and then we use that principle about knowledge that says knowledge requires believing something because it's true. And then we conclude you don't really know that these religious beliefs are true. So I think that's really what the argument's trying to get at. I think that is the argument in its final form. I have a quotation from Paul Churchland where he says it roughly in this form way back in 1984. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to read it. It's in Matter and Consciousness if you want to read it. If you were listening attentively, you heard that the first premise was, again, the assertion that you hold your religious beliefs as a result of early teaching and socialization. They were instilled into you from childhood. You were indoctrinated. That's a premise in the argument. And the argument needs that in order to work. They need it to be the case that there were these irrelevant influences on your religious beliefs. So that needs to be part of the argument. And I think a rational religious believer can deny that and say, like, that's not why I hold my religious beliefs. I hold my religious beliefs because of argument and evidence. But even if you grant that your religious beliefs were partly the result of irrelevant influences, as long as there were other influences that are connected to the truth in the right sort of way, that may be enough for knowledge. It could be that you hold a belief. This is you, by the way. This is you. Okay. And here's one influence on your religious beliefs, your society, your culture, what you were taught, who you happened to meet. You had all these social influences on your religious belief. But if you had other influences on your religious belief, good influences, arguments, evidence, truth, then that may be enough for your belief to count as knowledge. So here's just a quick example to help you see why that's true. It may be that if you were serving on a jury, for example, you might believe the defendant is guilty, in part for two kinds of reasons. some bad reasons, but some good reasons. Maybe you are the victim of various sorts of biases. Maybe you think men are more likely to commit crimes than women, or maybe the defendant has a face tattoo and that kind of biases you against the defendant or something like that. So you may have bad influences on your belief. You may be holding the belief in part for bad reasons. But if you also had really excellent evidence that the defendant is guilty and you're believing on that basis, then you can still know the defendant's guilty. So in a similar way, a religious believer can say the same sort of thing. Like, yeah, I admit I am the result partly of social forces, and I have been influenced by my culture and my parents and so on. I admit it. But also, I've got really good evidence in favor of my religious beliefs. I am connected to the truth in the right sort of way for it to count as knowledge. Then I think this argument doesn't need to worry the religious believer too much.
All right, well, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much again, Thomas. I've really enjoyed getting to talk with you.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you all for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.